The Reality Exchange by James Vigor. Small-time smuggler, Winter Starling, becomes a pawn in a bigger game. It's not what she wants, but no one gives her a choice. Her hitherto peaceful existence, living with her parents who own a mine close to Jova, a huge oceanside spaceport, is torn apart. Mining the much sought-after mineral asareite is a legal activity. Selling it for onward shipment to Earth, not so much. But where Winter's skills were once all focused on evading security and slipping her illicit shipments to her regular customers inside the port, things take a sudden and sinister turn. She has never been to Earth, never been into space, never wanted to travel beyond the bounds of her home planet, Arali. But suddenly, she's a pawn in someone else's game. The spinal implant that keeps her alive has made her a useful tool in someone else's armory. She must leave Jova and hitch a ride to Earth, and she must do it fast. Just finding someone to take her seems an insurmountable problem, but it turns out to be trivial in comparison to what is to come. And what neither Winter nor the person blackmailing her can know is that what makes her a useful pawn in one person's game will make her useful to someone else in ways that no one could have predicted.
Here's a debut science fiction novel called The Reality Exchange by James Vigor. It's not, again, particularly my taste in stories. It could be adapted rather easily to the script for a Hollywood action film. But I have to admit that once I started, I couldn't put the thing down. Forgive the cliche. James Vigor knows how to keep the reader engaged, not least by ending each chapter on a cliffhanger. And he isn't afraid to kill off a lot of the good guys during the carnage. It's brave and committed writing for a debut novel. The setting is futuristic, with interstellar travel and trade and an intergalactic war, but the war only forms the background. The core of the story is a hostage situation, driven purely by greed. The protagonist, who is called Winter Starling, has character and courage. By trade, she's a smuggler, which is rather fun. But almost throughout the novel, her actions are controlled by other people, and only intermittently does she show agency. It's unusual for an all-action story, but rather to my surprise, it works. The beleaguered spaceship captain, Orson, is forced by circumstances to make concessions incompatible with his principles, and gradually, bit by bit, he loses control of his crew and his passengers, and ultimately of himself. This deterioration of authority is very well drawn. The pirate captain, aptly named Grim, is motivated only by desire for money, and she's a pragmatist, adapting to changes in the situation in order to ensure that she'll profit in the end. In her, Mr. Vigor has portrayed the ultimate cynic. At the end of the novel, we learn something that opens the door to a possible sequel. If the sequel appears, then despite my usual avoidance of the kind of science fiction, I think I'll read it. James Vigor is an author with a distinctive voice and a fine ability to control an intricate plot without letting the pace drop. Well done, that man.
Hello, I'm James Vigor, and I'm here to read you a brief introduction to The Reality Exchange, an excerpt from Chapter 1. Orange sunlight beat down upon the road. Fine dust permeated the hot air, and soldiers in full-body armour struggled to keep the sweat from their brows. The light reflected off the gleaming white spires, surveillance towers, and antennae of Port Jova, which stood tall behind the concrete wall that had been smoothed by the dust in the seasonal winds. Corporal Barron waved on the latest visitors. His well-worn face creased to a yawn as he watched them roll on through the gate, scraping the grit from the corners of his eyes, but only managing to cause further irritation. He blinked through the tears that welled up in defiance of the hardy, authoritative presence he had hoped to impose, and caught sight of a line of pale, blurry shapes approaching along the road. The dejected fusion of a sigh and a groan slipped out as he clocked the incoming trade convoy, then quickly checked that none of his fellow soldiers were in earshot. The exhaustion was getting to them all, but he had to be seen setting an example. He stood up straight, wiped the moisture from his forehead, and took a swig of his tepid water. It would take some time to register and approve a convoy of this size, but he would do it with a determination and stamina that would make the other Aralians proud. "Move up! I want to be done with this lot in 5 minutes." They began to dawdle along the side of the road, slumped over and barely managing to keep their rifles held in 2 hands. The great cargo haulers were a curious blend of form and function, with cabins that curved back at the top and merged seamlessly into the large cargo container. Such industrial elegance, once white but now soiled and yellowed by the sandy winds, held aloft by 6 individually articulated sets of caterpillar tracks. One by one, the haulers rumbled to a stop, with the foremost vehicle a dozen metres short of the gate. Baron inflated his chest and held his rifle across his body as he marched confidently towards the cabin and looked up at the driver. "Your business?" he barked. A thin smile nested itself in the driver's black stubble. He swiped his fringe away from his eyes, leaned out of his window, and looked back at the long line of cargo haulers behind him before turning back to Baron. He lowered his sunglasses to the end of his nose. "Trade, I would imagine." "And what are you hauling?" "Only the finest in perfectly legitimate renewables, officer," he chirped with feigned enthusiasm. Baron fixed the driver with an unsmiling stare and watched the attempted levity deflate. "Plant matter, fertilizer, etc. All suitably boring, I can assure you." Baron drew out a small device, a glass tablet with a holographic display. The interface was nearly invisible out here, blending almost perfectly with the sunlight. "Thumbprint?" Baron held the device up. The driver pressed his thumb through one of the holograms and onto the glass. A chirping noise, barely audible over the sound of rumbling engines, confirmed an identification match. Baron held the device close to his chest to shield it from the sunlight. Even so, he had to squint to read the display. As he squeezed his eyelids together, drowsiness from the heat swept over him. He skimmed the driver's file. Everything seemed to check out. "Move up to the gate." Baron stepped back and waved his hand in dismissal. The driver pushed his sunglasses back up and made a toothy, almost cartoonish smile as he edged his vehicle towards the barrier. Another soldier, with a rifle across his chest, held up a hand to signal him to come to a stop. Baron made his way towards the back of the convoy, taking a quick swig of tepid water. It would take some time to sort through all the cargo, but once that was done, the approval would be quick and simple. Nearly halfway down the line, he glanced back towards the front. It took a couple of seconds too long for his weary mind to realise something was amiss. He stopped abruptly and shielded his eyes from the sunlight. Why was the door on the lead transport open? Where were the guards? Then a distant call. "Officer!" It came from about 100 yards away from the hauler, where the transport driver stood leaning against the starport wall. He raised a fist above his head. Was he holding something? A flash! A thunderous boom! The cargo hauler at the gate erupted into flames. The shockwave rushed out, kicking up an expanding wall of dust that slammed into Baron, punching the breath from his body and hurling him from his feet. There was darkness. Silence. Then Baron's lungs forced a sharp intake of breath and everything felt all too real. The heat of the ground beneath him, a throbbing pain in his chest and back, a piercing tone in his head, interrupted by rapid cracks in the distance. Gunfire. He forced his eyes to open. All he could make out in his stupor was a dark column of smoke rising into the sky. The gunshots became less frequent. Amid the chaos, yells turned to cries, shouts turned to screams. Then the sounds of conflict came to silence, and all Baron could hear around him was a whistling breeze and the rhythmic crunch of dirt beneath boots. His breaths rapid and irregular, his heart pounding loud and fast. Baron struggled to lift his head. The footsteps fell silent. Looming over him, dark against the white sky, was the silhouette of the driver. He felt a firm grasp around his ankles, then felt the ground scraping against the armour on his back, but it stopped after only a few seconds once he had been enveloped by the shade between two of the cargo haulers that remained intact. He felt a tug at his thigh as the man squatted over him and pulled his handgun from its holster. Baron found his own weapon aimed at him, inches from his face. The ringing in his ears was too loud for him to hear what the driver was saying. The man began calmly, but it wasn't long before he was making wild gestures, waving the gun all over the place. He was ranting, something about fairness and justice, but Baron was in pain and too tired to listen. He let his head fall back and his eyes close. Hey! Baron just hoped that somehow this would all go away. Come on now, Aurelian. This could still be a dream. It had to be. Not listening? All right. A bang! Searing pain in his left hand. Baron let out a scream, his eyes snapping open as his gut convulsed and he lurched upright, only to meet the sole of a boot that slammed him back into the dirt. He brought his hand up in front of his face. An enormous hole had been carved through it. His fingers hung off by the thin shreds of meat that remained. He couldn't stop crying out, clutching his hand to his chest. He was aware of the ranting voice, but all sense was drowned out by the pain. Occasional words slipped through. The war, Aurelian pioneers, solar conglomerate. Don't see the irony, do you? The man raised a blood-spattered eyebrow. The one non-renewable resource. The most valuable. The butt of the pistol came down towards him. Baron tried to pull his hand away. He couldn't move. The pain exploded as shrieks were ripped from inside him. I'm talking about you, dummy. The life of a person. Can't grow that back, can you? The ever-louder shouts made no sense. Baron pressed his eyes tightly closed, clutching at the fire in his hand, sobbing for home. Something cool pressed against the bridge of his nose. He looked to see his own pistol lined up between his eyes and stared transfixed. In his peripheral vision, he was aware of the man's mouth moving. More words. He couldn't listen, couldn't hear, could only pull in another breath, his last, as the bullet left the gun. The reality exchange is the story of Winter Starling, a smuggler from the planet Aureli who is given the task to deliver a message to Earth. The difficulty is, she has no idea who it's from, who it's for, or what it contains. What you've just heard is an excerpt from Chapter 1. For the rest of the story, head on over to Amazon and pre-order your copy of the ebook, or grab your copy of the paperback right now. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the ride.
A different Starling from Hannibal Lecter's nemesis, but equally resourceful. Now, this being James Vigor's first book, I had no idea what to expect when I picked it up. It's called The Reality Exchange. I found it written with a light touch that made it an easy read. And the main character, Winter Starling, is nowhere to be seen as the book opens. We see a group of border security guards at a spaceport heading towards the end of their shift. It's all routine and so on, and they're tired, end of day and so on. Of course, it's not the routine end of day that they're hoping for, but Winter Starling has no part in the ensuing chaos. Indeed, she has no interest in it, except insofar as it inconveniences her own plans. Now, the way that Starling is introduced like this gives the perfect picture of a young woman wrapped up in the minutiae of her own life. Uninterested in politics or the wider world. She lives at home with her parents, but she's carving out her own niche, well aware that she's doing some things her family wouldn't approve of. And she's careful, she hides some stuff. I like the way that she came across like that, just through the various machinations of how the book opens. I also like the fact that Starling bucks the trend for young people at the centre of space adventures. Space travel is definitely not on her bucket list. She's happy on her own planet. Her ambitions go a little further than her next deal. She lives for the day. As it turns out, she's got particular reasons to live her life that way, but it works very well. Now, I'm not as such reviewing this book. which is great for me because I don't feel constrained by the usual boundaries of a book review. And anyway, there are plenty of really good reviews on this book for anyone to read. What I'm doing is diving into specific aspects of these Spotlight books from Fantastic Books Publishing's massive autumn book launch event. So, what I particularly want to look at is travel through space, through deep space, the way that I personally would like to travel through deep space, should the opportunity arise. Think about it, humankind's been creeping closer to large-scale space exploration for decades. The idea of travelling to a distant star system has always appealed to me, but to be honest, I've pretty much hung up my travel boots when it comes to long-haul terrestrial flights, and I really don't think I could cope with the physical rigours of space travel. That is, until I read the way that James Vigor envisaged it in The Reality Exchange. And it was the way that this aspect particularly intrigued me that prompted me to ask James Vigor a rather convoluted question that went like this. Winter Starling's views on immersive virtual reality will chime with a lot of people. She's tried it but doesn't care for it, though there comes a point where it's a level of escapism she realises she needs. Not to mention there is a point where she gets no choice. I found that the way you used immersive virtual reality in long-distance space travel was one of those ideas that feel obvious once explained, but not something I'd have thought up for myself. The way you presented it, it felt like something credible, even if we're a long way off being able to do it. Do you think it could become a reality? Now, in answer to that rather rambling question, I was pleased to get a comprehensive reply which confirmed my belief that this was an area he'd really thought through. And this is what he said. There was a time not too long ago that I might have been sceptical about the future of VR. Shortly after the release of the first mainline commercial VR headsets, the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, it began to feel like the price of entry was too high and that the industry wasn't taking it as seriously as it should. I was worried for a while that it would all just fade into obscurity and we'd look back on it as just another fad. While those issues haven't truly gone away, I think VR is over the hurdle now. Standalone VR headsets are cheaper than current generation games consoles. There are plenty of things that can only be experienced in VR that I would heartily recommend everyone to try. It really does feel like something special. In the Reality Exchange, the technology is incredibly advanced. It provides sensory input directly to the user's brain and gives them full natural motor control over a virtual version of their own body, all while leaving their real body motionless and unconscious, paired with a form of suspended animation that keeps them healthy and protected over several weeks of space travel. I couldn't speculate on whether we'll ever see virtual reality reach such incredible levels of immersion, nor do I have the kind of education to speak about the future of suspended animation, but my short answer to the question is absolutely yes. Given the state of technology today, I believe that this kind of usage of VR is not only plausible, but inevitable. In the Reality Exchange, it's essentially a form of travel entertainment. We already have cars with screens built into the seats so people can watch films or play games while they're on the road. It doesn't feel like a stretch to think that VR headsets could be included in a particularly luxurious package. Perhaps it would be something seen more on planes, where journey times are longer and motion sickness is less of a concern. VR is being used all over the place already. There are all sorts of things, from exhibitions to theme park rides, that use virtual reality as a way of enhancing the experience by drawing people into immersive new worlds. I don't see any reason why we couldn't see VR used as a way to ease the tedium of lengthy travel times today, with a high enough budget. Virtual reality technology is really still in its infancy, I'd like to think that one day we'll be able to dive completely into a whole new world the way Winter Starling does. She had a pretty rough go of it the first time, but I'm sure even she would agree that there's something wonderful about it. Well, thanks for that, James. I'm sold. I'll take the first spaceship with fully immersive VR and a ticket that I can afford.
The Book Programme, presented by Hannah Murray.
Joining us on the line now from the UK is James Vigor. He is a computer games programmer who has a degree in computer games technology, specialising in computer games programming. His debut novel is out now. It's called The Reality Exchange, and it explores how the technology we rely on can be turned against us. It's described as a fast-moving space adventure. Welcome to the book show, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us. And very exciting to have your debut novel out.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is something that I've been looking forward to for a long time in my life. I've always wanted to have some kind of creative writing under my belt since a very young age, when I had no idea the kind of process that was involved in doing something like that. And I would just start writing something that was very clearly a rip-off of something I'd already seen before. Like, you could just read it and go, yeah, that's Harry Potter he's trying to write there. It's great to finally have the time and the knowledge to sit down, plan it out properly, and put together something proper. So yeah, I'm really excited to have something finally out in people's hands.
Fantastic. And I have to ask you about your studies, working as a computer games programmer, having got a degree in it. A lot of older people would think, what? You can get a degree in computer games technology? How does it all work then?
So I studied in the University of Portsmouth, and it was a computer games technology degree. And so there are a lot of things that go into making a computer game, from programming to art to design, and they're all very different skills. But the degree, it gave everyone the general stuff that they needed early on, and then you specialize later on. So I went down the programming route because I wanted to be sort of the one building the world as it was and seeing everything come together. I've always had that pleasure by being able to visualize something in my head and then see the process through until it actually works in front of you. And yeah, I guess it's kind of the same with a lot of artistic pursuits. And I do see computer games programming as an art form in itself. If I was doing the art for the game, having a vision and then seeing that through, there's an immense pleasure in that.
And have you done anything since graduating? Have you made any games, as it were?
So I'm a junior programmer at a company in Bristol called Ground Shatter. We're working on a game right now called Fights in Tight Spaces, which is a turn-based strategy brawling game. That's been a lot of fun to work on, and that should be out fairly soon. So it won't be long before I've got my name in some actual credits. Well, that's quite exciting as well.
Yeah, definitely. So when did the idea for this book come about then, The Reality Exchange?
The idea for The Reality Exchange first came up quite a while ago now. It was in my first year of sixth form, about 5 or 6 years ago now, that the original idea struck. And I was having a bit of a tough time in sixth form. What with studies and everything, I was finding it all really stressful. But I had this idea, and I didn't want to try and make the time to do that on top of everything else. And also because I'd had so many ideas in the past that hadn't worked out, I decided to give myself a bit of time to make sure that it's absolutely what I wanted to do. So I waited until the very end of my studies and the last exams were passed. I realized that I still wanted to write it, and this idea had been developing in my head for all that time. And when I finally got to university, that was when I decided that, you know, my life was changing and I wanted to finally make that step and start plotting it out and writing it.
And then how did you find the process of writing the book?
I was quite fortunate in that I knew a few people through Fantastic Books Publishing, who was the publisher that the Reality Exchange is published through, because I've worked with them in the past on various other things. Another author of theirs called Drew Wagar, who I've always really admired his work, and we've been good friends as well. So the first thing I did was reach out to him and say, you know, where do you recommend I start? I figured the first thing that I should do is reach out to someone who's had that experience and can give me that useful guidance. And he basically put me on to how to go about planning a book. And it all came down to this one definitive planning resource, this one document that lists out the biographies of your characters, the technologies in the book, the settings, the politics, all of this stuff that would eventually be relevant in the plot. And it's so useful to have all that stuff planned out so that when you're writing your scenes, you know how things have to play out. And you don't have these weird little... so as a science fiction book, I have a few technologies in my book that have to work consistently throughout the plot. And just having that one thing that I can always look back to and go, okay, it's supposed to work like that, means that it never deviates from that. And so at least in that sense, there aren't any plot holes because it always works the same.
Yeah, that's very clever doing it like that. So you're going to continue to use that method, are you? Absolutely, yes. And in fact, I'm pushing it even further now because the fact of the matter is I don't like planning. That's not the fun part. It's a necessary step. But when you're just sitting down for days on end writing notes, it's not terribly fun. But because I've learned exactly just how useful it can be, I'm really pushing that as far as it can be. So I'm doing everything from character appearances to backgrounds and biographies, all of the different settings and how they look and how they work. I'm going into much more detail now than I did for the Reality Exchange for future projects. So tell us about the characters involved in the Reality Exchange. Sure. So it all focuses around a character called Winter Starling. She's a smuggler from a planet called M.A.B.L.E. One day she returns to her own home and finds herself ambushed. As a result of that ambush, she finds that she has a message stored in a spinal implant that she has, which is basically vital for keeping her alive. And all she knows about that message is that she has to take it to Earth. She doesn't know who it's from, who it's for, or what it contains. And the characters in the book are characters that she meets along the way, the crew of the ship that she ends up boarding, and various other people that she encounters along the way. She's never been into space before, so all these perils start to become evident to her as she goes and has to deal with those. And as she's leaving her home planet behind, she's leaving behind everyone that she's ever learned to rely on. And so all these new characters are people she has to discover whether she can really trust them and who she can put her faith in and learn to rely on now. And what kind of age have you aimed the book at, would you say? Really, I was always aiming the book at myself. You know, it was a plot that, it was a story that I wanted to write because it was a story that I thought I wanted to read. There have been quite a lot of different people from different age groups picking it up now. I guess it always felt to me like a sort of late teens to young adults, but it doesn't really fit into I wouldn't say it's a YA book. It's an adult book, but it's accessible to a wider audience. Yeah, good stuff. So I'm also interested to ask you about the money that you've raised for various charities over the years. I started off really as a bit of a live streamer. I've done various live streams where I've just streamed gameplay and got other people on board and had some really fun experiences talking to people. And eventually, I think it was in 2015, I decided to run a 24-hour live stream over a weekend dedicated to Cancer Research UK. So the whole time I was asking people to donate to a Just Giving page for that charity, and we raised £2,500 over the course of that weekend, which was absolutely incredible. And I wanted to sort of spread that love going forward, and so we did in consecutive years. In 2016, we did a similar charity fundraiser for NAS, which is the National Ankylosing Spondylitis Society. And the year after that, we did Special Effect, which is a charity all about making games accessible to people with disabilities who wouldn't normally be able to play video games with a keyboard and mouse or a normal, an Xbox controller or something like that. Oh, great idea. And you were actually one of the top 5% of fundraisers on Just Giving in 2015. That's pretty cool. Yes, it was brilliant to have that accolade through the post. It was unfortunately a bit rainy, so the certificate's a bit damaged, but it's nonetheless something that I really treasure. That feels like one of my greatest accomplishments to date, to know that I've made that kind of a difference. Yeah, wonderful. And you were saying you were playing video games online for 24 hours, were you? Yes, it gets tough, and it's
I have my family behind the scenes, delivering me food and coffee and things to help keep me going. On the last one I did in 2017, I made the mistake of having a few shots of whiskey just past midnight because I thought it might be nice to do a sort of. I played a horror game. I don't normally play horror games, but I thought if I get a little bit drunk, it might be slightly more palatable. But I'd never had whiskey before, so I kind of overdid it, and it was a bit of a disaster come the end. I didn't quite manage to make the full 24 hours, unfortunately, but it was. But we still raised a lot of money, and it was still good fun, and that was all that really mattered at the end.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, if people want to get a copy of your book, it's called The Reality Exchange, and it's available on our website in the bookshop section. It's by James Vigor, who we've been chatting to today. James, thanks ever so much for joining us, and best of luck.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
The Book Programme. Presented by Hannah Murray. Inform, comment, entertain.